Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Crittenden of Epiphany of Christ Lutheran Church in Apache Junction, Arizona, and welcome to our Bible study. We're looking a little more deeply at the gospel reading from last Sunday, August 23rd, and this is the story of Jesus and his disciples at a place called Caesarea Philippi. And this is where Jesus asks the question, who do you say that I am? And Peter gives his great confession. And so we want to get a little more deeply into this reading, because one of the things we need to always be acknowledging is that the things that are written down in our scriptures do not exist outside of a context. And if we're going to understand what it is that's happening, we need to be able to understand what that context is, because it's a very different context than our 21st century one. And so that's part of why we do these Bible studies. And so what we're going to do is begin by just rereading what our gospel reading was on Sunday. And this is from the 16th chapter of Matthew, and it begins at verse 13. Excuse me. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So let's go back through here. We'll kind of stop along the way and talk about some things. And the first thing that we want to do comes in the 13th verse, and that is to explore the significance of where they are. This is a detail. When we find details in the Gospels, they are there for a reason. Some places that we read about the things that Jesus are doing, it's just called that place. But not here. We're told precisely where Jesus is, and that is the district of Caesarea Philippi. Now, this is a district, Caesarea Philippi. There is a city, and it's a district within the kingdom and the empire. And there is a history to this. This place has not been called Caesarea Philippi for very long at the time that we read this. In fact, maybe only 20 or 30 years before that, what is known in our scriptures as Caesarea Philippi was called by another name, which is Panaea. It was called Panaea because it had been a city and a district that had been dedicated to the Greek and Roman god Pan. And so let's learn a little bit about this god Pan. In Greek mythology, Pan was the god of a couple of things. One is that Pan was the god of theatrical criticism. And I don't really know a great deal about that because I haven't studied a lot about early Greek antiquity theatrical criticism, but I do know that because he's the god of theatrical criticism, there is a word that that gets used that is based on his name, and that is when we read about, a play on Broadway that people didn't care for very much, they say that it was panned. And the reason that that word is used is because this Greek god was the god of theatrical criticism. But he was also the god of shepherds and flocks. And for that reason, he was depicted as having being half man and half goat. Now, he was, because of being a god to shepherds, this is out in the wilderness, we don't see temples to Pan being built. Instead, what would happen is that throughout the area where Pan was worshipped, people would find a significant place, usually a cave or a spring, and they would dedicate that to the worship of Pan. And one of those, the largest one, happened to be in this place that was later named Caesarea Philippi. It was a spring that was actually a cave. It was a cave out of which emerged water, a large stream of water, very large stream of water, and it watered the area, made the area very, very fertile. And one of the things in Greek mythology that people understood was that the other gods, remember, there was always more gods than one, and gods for various different things. And one of the things they believed is that the area fertility gods would, from time to time during the year, they would retreat into these caves that were dedicated to Pan. And the result of that was winter. Because the fertility gods were gone, because they had left, winter would come upon, and there, of course, was no crops and no growing, no new life that was happening. Well, in order to entice those gods back out of those caves, an enticement that would bring about spring and the planting season and so on, we would find that at these places that were dedicated to Pan, there would be human sacrifices. So these, as part of their worship, they would kill people. They would sacrifice live people into these springs and these caves in order to show, to let the gods who were retreating into that cave, let those fertility gods know that those gods were being worshipped. And because this would happen everywhere where there was one of these caves dedicated to the god Pan, because of that, each one of these locations became known as one of the gates of Hades, the gates of the place of the dead. And one of the larger ones was this one near what became known as Caesarea Philippi. So that's the geography and the social setting of this place where Jesus and his disciples are. One of the characteristics of this god, Pan, is really kind of interesting. A little bit of a guy after my own heart, in that he would always take an afternoon nap. He would always lay down in the afternoon, take a nap, fall asleep, and then something would occur that would make him wake up. And as he awoke with a startled scream that those around him would also adopt. And so he would have this startled scream as he awoke, and the people around him would react in the exact same way. Just like we had panned for the criticism, there was a word that developed that referred to this reaction that he was having and those around him would have, and that is panic. So to panic is to have this startled scream, and that was the reaction that people had to this god Pan. Now, one of the things that's happening that we see Jesus doing, particularly when he's in these places where there's so much pagan worship, is that he's trying to show differentiation. And the gospel writers are showing how Jesus is different than these other gods. And hopefully this brought into memory for Jesus' disciples as he has brought them to Caesarea Philippi, this place that includes one of the gates of Hades, and Jesus refers to the gates of Hades, and to this god Pan, who would wake startled and screaming and create panic. Hopefully it would cause the disciples to remember what just happened a few chapters ago in Matthew. And I hope that maybe some of you had that too. So let's go back to Matthew 8, and this is at verse 23. And I want you to see the connection between the story we read here in 28 and what Jesus is doing in chapter 16. This is chapter 8, verse 23. And when Jesus got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he was asleep. And they went and woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." And Jesus woke up, threw his hands in the air, screamed, "We're all going to die." No, that's not what happened. "Lord, save us, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. They were amazed, saying, "What sort of man is this?" So I hope you can see the difference that's being displayed here of the reaction of Jesus waking up from a sleep in the midst of this chaos compared to what the god Pan does, the god that's being worshipped at Caesarea Philippi. Let's go along a little bit further in the reading then. This is Jesus, again, in the district of Caesarea Philippi, asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And we talked Sunday that Son of Man is one of the terms that's used for the Messiah. And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." So what's happening here is that Jesus is being linked very closely to the tradition of the prophets of the Old Testament. And so we need to remember then, when we hear the word prophet, a prophet is not somebody who predicts the future. A prophet is somebody who is interpreting the present for God, which is to say that the prophet speaks for God to God's people, interpreting the present, teaching them what it is that's going on. And of course, what we're going to learn is that Jesus is not a prophet who speaks for God, but of course, Jesus is God. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, this is very interesting that Peter would call Jesus the Son of the living God, particularly in this, was that the right word? Particularly in this place called Caesarea Philippi. And the reason that that's so significant is the history of this god Pan. Now, there's a story that's told in Greek mythology that there was a sailor who was sailing to Italy. And while he's out on the sea, he heard a divine voice that was coming from across the waters. And the voice said to him, "Themis, are you here?" Now, I find that really kind of interesting that this God has to say, "Can you hear me now? Themis, are you there? When you reach Palodes, take care to proclaim that the great god Pan is dead." So Pan, the god who has a cave and a spring, the largest one dedicated to him in Caesarea Philippi, Greek mythology says that God was dead. And yet Peter says, you are the Messiah, Son of the living God, making a connection, the difference between Pan and Jesus. Pan creates panic. Jesus tries to dispel fear. And Jesus answered, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." Jesus is pulling rank on Peter here a little bit. All right. He's saying, he's referring to Jesus. He's referring to Peter as Simon. All right. That's his name. Peter, more of a nickname. Peter is not the Greek version of the name Simon. Simon actually is the Greek version. In Hebrew, the name would be Shimon, just as Jesus is the Greek version of the Hebrew name Joshua, and Jonah is the Hebrew version of the Greek name John. But Jesus says here, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." Right? Peter is the son of a man named Jonah. Jesus is the Son of God. "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." So Jesus himself is using the language of Greek mythology here, not just talking about the place where dead people go as Hades, but he's actually referring to the gates of Hades, one of which, in fact, the largest one, is dedicated to Pan there at Caesarea Philippi. "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Notice this language here. Friends, this is so very important. There's church tradition, and of course our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters are saying that this was making Peter the first pope, that he was putting Peter in charge of the church. And yet that's not what's happening. Listen to the language that Jesus uses. "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Right? He's not saying, "I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." These are not keys that let people in or out of the kingdom of heaven. He is teaching about the kingdom and what the keys of the kingdom are. "And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." That's really curious. We really don't have a great understanding of what that is, other than to say that if you bind yourself to the earthly ways of looking at things, then you're not going to get yourself into the kingdom of heaven. Not to heaven, but into the kingdom. And so lose those things. Don't bind yourself to earthly things, to worldly ways of understanding yourself and others. Bind yourself to holy ways of doing this. And then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. And that's kind of curious. This is known as the Messianic secret. Why is it that Jesus, from time to time, when he is identified as the Messiah, tells the identifier not to say anything? We've got cases where it's a demon that has recognized Jesus as the Messiah, and he makes sure that the demon doesn't get to say that to anybody. But here it is his disciples. His disciples now understand that he is the Messiah, and he's telling them not to say anything to anybody. And the reason for that, it's not really as deep a mystery as it would seem, as some conspiratorial ways of looking at Scripture would have it understood. There's something incredibly important here that hasn't yet happened, and it's referred to here. Remember that Jesus is called the Son of the living God. We have the story of Pan, the death of Pan being announced. And we have, of course, further along in the story of Jesus Christ, his own death. So it's no wonder that on that Good Friday, the sight of the person that they identified as their Messiah hanging dead on a cross would create so much problem for and fear for Jesus's disciples. Whether they believed Jesus was a king and a warrior who was going to save them from the Roman Empire, or they believed that he was their God, and now they have seen, like Pan, they have seen their God be dead. Of course, Jesus's death is not the end of his story. His story moves on with the resurrection. And then once Jesus has been resurrected and Jesus goes to them, again, they are in fear, just as they were on the boat when Jesus awoke. Here, Jesus awaking again. An analogy of being asleep is an analogy for death is to be asleep. Jesus is awake again, resurrected. He actually died. They saw it happening. We have great descriptions of Jesus' death. And now Jesus' disciples see him again. So their God is not dead. Everything that can be said about Pan cannot be said about Jesus, and Jesus is proving that to him. He's proving that he is the Messiah, the promise of the prophets in the Old Testament, and the fulfillment of the covenant with Abraham is that the Jews, through the Jews, God would be redeeming the entire world. And so therefore, Jesus has to differentiate himself from the gods of the world. Because remember, Jesus' disciples then, these 11 people who are so scared, they've locked themselves into this upper room, they are afraid, they're hiding under the tables, and suddenly Jesus appears among them. And again, he says, do not be afraid. But then Jesus sends them out in the world to tell people about the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection and of their God. And not once does Jesus tell them to respect the religion of the people that you're going to come across, because everybody that they come across believes in a pantheon of gods, believes in a number of gods. And they are to reveal God in Jesus Christ to them so that they stop worshiping these other gods, these gods who can do nothing for them, and instead that they would turn to Jesus Christ, the only God who can actually care for them. So hopefully this illuminates a little bit this story of what's happening at Caesarea Philippi, why it's happening there, and what connections Jesus is intending to make with that. This story is very closely aligned with next week's gospel reading. So we're going to continue this conversation a little bit. And as I said Sunday, we're going to see that this great moment that Peter had is not going to last very long. I sure hope that you'll join us again next week for the Bible study. And until then, God bless you.